Let's now display the list of names from our React application. We have an API, it receives a comma-separated list of name IDs, and it returns an object ready for us to look up any name by ID. We'll go ahead and use this API to place the actual names in our UI. So the first thing we need, when we load a contest, we need to start fetching these names. We don't want to fetch the names unless we are on a contest. So for example, in this main view, I don't need any names. When I click on a contest, I need the contest to fetch its own names. So inside the contest class, this is a candidate for component didMount code. So when I mount a contest component, we can instruct React to go back to the API and fetch the list of names. However, I want to keep all the state in the app component. I don't want to put any state here in the contest component. So instead of fetching the names here directly, I'll assume that the app component is going to pass down a property for every contest to fetch the names. So let's actually start there. Let's assume that the app component is going to pass a fetch names function, and we'll come back to this function in a little bit. So inside the contest component, I have a new property, which is fetch names. So prop types.function, and I'll make that required as well. And inside component didMount, we can simply just call this new function, this.props.fetch names. Let's invoke it using the name IDs of this current contest. So this.props.name IDs, just like that. So I also need to define the name IDs property since this is the first time I'm using it. Name IDs is a prop types.array, and it's also required. So I think this component is good to go. Inside the app component, let's assume that this fetch names function is defined on this instance. So we'll call it fetch names. And let's go define it. I'll define it right here under fetch contest list. Fetch names is a simple function, and it's not going to do anything to the state. It will only fetch from the API. So we don't have an API call to fetch the name. So let's assume that we have an API.fetch names. This top level function is going to receive the name IDs array. And let's just pass it as is to the API. And the API is going to return a response. So let's assume the API is going to give us back the names object. So let's simply put this object on the state. So this.setState, the names object. And now let's go define this API. So under API.js, it will be similar to fetch contest. Let me copy it from here and call this fetch names. It will receive a name IDs array, and it will go to /API/names. And in here, let's go ahead and use name IDs.join because it's an array. Let's join it with a comma. So the response is going to be in this shape. So let's return response.data.names directly. Cool. So let's actually test all that. We're still not displaying the names, but we can test that we are accessing the names on the state. So now if I refresh, I get the list of names here on the state. Very cool. So now all I need to do is use this structure to look up the actual names of this contest. Now I need to do the lookup in here. In fact, let me actually start the code in here. So I'll keep just one item. And in here, we're going to start with this.props.nameIDs. And I'm going to map this into the actual names. So this is going to give me a single name ID. And I want to map every name ID into an LI that displays the actual name here. So let me actually test that this is working just by typing name ID in there, and it looks like this is working. We have 101, 102, and we just need to look it up in here. Now I have two major options here. Because the name structure is in the app component, I can pass it down here to the contest, just like that. Names is this.state.names, and then do the lookup in contest itself. Or I can pass in a lookup function, so lookup name, and I'll have the contest component just invoke that function to look up a name on the state. So we'll use this.lookup name here. Let's actually go ahead and write this function. Lookup name is going to be a function that receives a name ID, and it will simply return this.state.names for that name ID. And now I have a new function on the props here. So lookup name is a function that is also required. and I can simply use it in here directly. So we can do this dot props dot lookup name for this name ID. Now this is all good, except there's one problem. When we first load up this page, the names structure is not going to be available on the state. It's actually going to be an undefined because we only set it on component did mount. So we need to account for that. So inside the lookup name, I'm going to do a simple if condition here. And the if condition is if I don't have names on the state, so if not this.state.names, or if I can't do this.state.names for that name ID, let's just return an indicator that I don't have the names. So potentially here you can do a loader or a moving dots to indicate that we don't have the names. We are probably still fetching those names from the database. It will probably be instant here because we're working on the same API server, but we'll try to simulate a slow API endpoint and see that in effect. So I think we can test. Reload. It looks like we have an error, so let's take a look at that. This error will be on the server side. So names of undefined in the app component line 74, which we just wrote, because this is this.state. And the reason we're getting the error in here is because we're doing server-side rendering before we do client-side rendering. So Node will always give you the error first. So we actually have another warning right here. This is happening because we have a dynamic array, remember? So we need a key. So let me provide a key here. So this key can just be the name ID. And server is loading now, no errors. So let's test. And I think we have another problem. This will actually return the name object itself. So we're trying to render an object directly in the contest here. That's not going to work. So what we need is .name. However, if we do that, then in here, instead of returning a string directly, we need to return a name is loading. So this is a fake name object. Let's try it now. And there you go. Names are showing up now. So let me actually test a few of the contests. I think this third one has 3 names, according to our data, working. And this fourth one has no names at all. And looks like we have an edge case here because we're hitting an API endpoint without any names, and it's saying 404 not found. So we can solve this in multiple ways. We can solve it in the API itself, or we can solve it from the front end here, and inside fetch names, we can guard this and say if we don't have any names, so if name IDs.length, remember this is an array, equals 0, then basically do nothing. So just return, otherwise fetch. So let's refresh this to test, and you'll see no names, no call to the API. So I think we're good there. Let's make sure this is still working correctly. Perfect. So I think we're done listing the names. Let me actually show you how, if we have a slow API, it's going to first show 3 dots, and then it will show the name. So testing that is easy. In the backend API, and under the names name ID, we'll put all of this code in a timeout call. So now the API is going to take 4 seconds to return the names. So let's see how the UI behave. Refresh, and you'll see that the names are listed as dots, and then after 4 seconds, it shows the actual names.